The first strike of guitar strings slices through the noise, raw, urgent, unmistakable. The sound of Creedence Clearwater Revival's Fortunate Son explodes into a collage of late 1960s America. Helicopters rising against jungle backdrops, university students marching with anti-war placards, television announcers speaking against the hum of typewriters and sirens, soldiers waving from departing planes. On one screen, children wave flags at a parade. On another, protesters burn those same flags in the street. The contradiction is jarring, yet deeply American. For millions of listeners, those opening chords are pure adrenaline. They sound like victory, like confidence, like the pulse of a country flexing its strength. For decades, the song's rebellious energy has been woven into military montages, football games, and campaign rallies. To some, it feels like a patriotic anthem celebrating rugged independence, America's working class, its courage, its grit. But listen closer, past the beat that stirs your foot and the guitar that makes your blood quicken. What you'll find isn't pride at all, it's fury. Fortunate Son is no celebration of power, it's a howl against privilege. It was written by John Fogerty, a man who wore the uniform, who understood what service meant, and who saw firsthand how America's promise of equality vanished when real sacrifice was required. Fogerty wasn't shouting for the anthem, he was shouting against injustice. Yet somehow, the world heard triumph instead of rage. The contradiction tells us something about America itself, its unique tendency to transform rebellion into pride, to sand down the uncomfortable edges of truth. The guiding question, then, is simple. How did one of the angriest protest songs ever written become one of the most misunderstood in modern music? How did a scathing indictment of class privilege turn into a blue-collar anthem belted proudly at rallies, parades, and even military flyovers? To answer that, we have to move backward, to the world that shaped the song and the man who wrote it. Before the fury came the myth, and before the protest chords rang out, there was an era when America believed, almost without question, in its own fairness. The story of Fortunate Son begins not with war or rebellion, but with optimism, with the confident hum of post-war America, where every child was told they could succeed if only they worked hard enough. It's there, amid chrome cars and new televisions, that this contradiction first took root. After World War II, America glowed with self-assurance. The soldiers had come home victorious. The economy was booming, and a generation of families moved from crowded cities to newly built suburbs that promised stability, safety, and the good life. Rows of neat lawns and identical houses stretched across the landscape, each one a small emblem of progress. Factories roared, highways expanded, and televisions flickered to life in living rooms across the country. People called it the American dream. And for many, it truly seemed possible. But that dream came with blind spots. In the 1950s, the country spoke endlessly about equality and merit, about opportunity available to anyone willing to work. Schools taught it, advertisements echoed it, and the popular music of the time hummed with the optimism of endless promise. Few paused to question who was being included in that story and who was not. John Fogerty grew up just outside San Francisco, in El Cerrito, a working-class suburb of Berkeley. His father worked for a small newspaper, his mother, a teacher. They weren't poor, but neither were they secure. From a young age, Fogerty understood the gap between those who had resources and those who simply endured. The family wasn't insulated by wealth or influence. Yet the world he saw on television portrayed America as equal, a land where background didn't matter. It was a comforting illusion that would fracture as he came of age. Music became Fogerty's language long before politics entered his world. He was captivated by the early electricity of rock and roll, The way Chuck Berry's guitar riffs merged with the rebellion of youth culture. The way Elvis turned rhythm and blues into something that could move suburban teenagers to dance. The energy of that new sound promised freedom, a kind of escape from conformity. For working-class kids like Fogerty and his bandmates, rock and roll wasn't about money or fame, it was about belonging. By the early 1960s, Fogerty's band, eventually known as Creedence Clearwater Revival, had begun to carve its identity. They rejected the psychedelic swirl dominating the San Francisco scene and instead leaned into the stripped-down traditions of early American rock, blues, country, and swampy southern grooves. Their sound was grounded, straightforward, unpretentious, reflections of the people who listened to them. Mechanics, soldiers, factory workers. Fogerty didn't sing from a mansion's balcony. He sang from the front porch of every average American household. Meanwhile, the world beyond the suburbs was changing fast. The Cold War had wrapped the nation in a moral narrative. Americans were told they were defenders of freedom, standing against the shadow of communism. Patriotism was sacred. Obedience was virtue. The country projected unity, but beneath that image, divisions festered, especially economic ones. Those idyllic neighborhoods of identical houses symbolized success, but also drew invisible borders between the comfortable and the struggling. For young men coming of age in the early 1960s, another institution stood quietly in the background: the Selective Service Draft. Every boy turned 18 knowing his name might be drawn. The card was small, almost trivial in appearance, but it carried weight. In times of crisis, that piece of paper could separate a dream deferred from a life rewritten. In those years before Vietnam dominated the headlines, the draft seemed a civic duty more than a threat. Parents reminisced about fighting the good war against tyranny. Sons grew up believing service was a test of manhood and loyalty. But America's view of service and sacrifice still leaned heavily on class. Who got sent and who got spared had never been truly equal. That truth would become painfully clear once the jungle war in Southeast Asia started demanding lives by the thousands. From his modest neighborhood, Fogerty watched America enter the 1960s with a split personality. On the surface, there was progress, civil rights marches, talk of equality, a space race that promised to unite everyone under one flag. But for working families, the promised fairness of post-war opportunity was beginning to crumble. Wages lagged behind corporate profits. College tuition soared beyond reach. And into this growing sense of imbalance came a new kind of fear. The fear of being chosen to fight in a war few fully understood. It's important to remember that this era wasn't defined by cynicism yet. It was defined by trust. People still believed the government's word, the nightly news, and the notion that America always fought on the side of freedom. Fogerty himself shared some of that faith, but his experiences would gradually strip it away. The difference between belief and reality would become the central emotional thread of his later music. Songs like Born on the Bayou and Green River carried the spirit of simple, working-class authenticity, but Fortunate Son would transform that authenticity into outrage. To understand why, we have to follow the path from that bright suburban decade into the shadows of the Vietnam Draft Board, a system that exposed the gulf between appearance and justice more clearly than any sermon or slogan ever could. The dream of equality had become a mask. Behind it, the mechanisms of privilege were quietly at work, deciding whose sons would go and whose sons would stay. In the years to come, that small card in every young man's wallet would become not just a symbol of service, but a measure of class. And so, beneath the buzz of summer televisions and the glow of neon diners, seeds of disillusionment were already taking root. For John Fogerty, they would take years to surface. growing quietly through army drills, long recording sessions, and watching too many families lose too much. The sound of the contradiction was already humming, the sound that would one day explode in 3 minutes of rock and roll fury. But before that explosion came the divide, the invisible wall built not of ideology, but of opportunity. And while America celebrated its prosperity on glowing screens, many young men started to realize that, when the call came, not everyone's phone would ring. By the mid-1960s, the quiet hum of American optimism began to bend under pressure. The Vietnam War had gone from a distant advisory mission to a grinding conflict, claiming thousands of lives. For the young men of America, the selective service system suddenly stopped being an abstract civic duty. It became a lottery of fate. Every mailbox carried the possibility of a letter that could change a life overnight. On paper, the draft looked fair. Every American man turning 18 registered, his name dropping into the same pool. It was patriotism by procedure, another sign of shared national responsibility. The slogan echoed from town halls to classrooms, "We all serve." But in practice, the promise of equality quickly fell apart. The draft was never random. It was a mirror of a country still stratified by class, opportunity, and influence. Behind the idea of fairness stood a structure built on advantage. The wealthy and well-connected had access to escape hatches hidden in plain sight. The 2S college deferment was the most obvious. It postponed military service for anyone enrolled full-time at a university. For families who could afford tuition, that single classification meant safety. Another 4 years behind ivy-covered walls. Another 4 years of waiting for the war to end. It was an expensive kind of immunity, and in towns where college wasn't an option, young men watched their classmates vanish into campuses while they lined up at recruitment offices. Doctors and family connections offered other routes to safety. A medical deferment, if properly documented, could remove you from consideration entirely. Some were legitimate, real conditions that made service impossible. But the system was pliable, sympathetic to certain names and neighborhoods. A private physician's note could carry more weight than an honest cough. Rumors spread of examiners turning blind eyes to falsified records, of well-known families with sons declared unfit only on paper, real or imagined. Those stories hardened resentment on factory floors and in draft offices across the country. Then there were the National Guard and the Army Reserve, part-time service paths often portrayed as patriotic alternatives. Training weekends, no combat deployment, and the promise of security at home. In theory, anyone could apply. In reality, the waiting lists were endless, except for the few whose fathers knew the right person to call. Newspapers told stories of governors' sons and local power brokers quietly finding places in units that never left their home states. To young men with no such access, this confirmed what they already suspected. Even in duty and danger, privilege found protection. And so the phrase, "a rich man's war, a poor man's fight," circulated not as a slogan, but as lived experience. In towns across the Midwest, the South, and the industrial corridors of California, blue-collar sons shouldered rifles, while the children of executives studied political science or business administration. Communities watched buses carry local boys away, often never to return. At the same time, college campuses filled with those who would soon debate the very policies sending others to war. The divide wasn't only visible in economics, it was personal. Entire neighborhoods seemed emptied of young men overnight. A mother's pride in her son's service mixed with a gnawing fear each time the news listed new casualties. For families without resources, support meant sending care packages and praying. For wealthier households, support often meant attending luncheons and fundraisers, their sons safely home. The symbolism of shared American duty fractured completely. John Fogerty was one of those caught in the middle. In 1966, the guitarist and songwriter from El Chirrito received his draft notice. He wasn't from money, and there were no family strings to pull. College wasn't a realistic refuge, and avoiding service would mean breaking the law, but he wasn't a protester either. While demonstrations filled city squares and draft cards burned on the evening news, Fogerty took a different route. He enlisted in the Army Reserve. It was a decision born from caution and circumstance, not strategy. It meant 6 months of active training and additional years of weekend duty, a compromise between obligation and survival. Inside that structure, Fogerty witnessed the human shape of the divide. His fellow recruits came from similar backgrounds: truck drivers' sons, mechanics, men who worked in small shops or towns without universities. He saw camaraderie among them, a quiet understanding of shared burden. But he also noticed who wasn't there: the sons of lawyers, bankers, and state officials. That absence said more than any protest sign. It revealed how systematically unequal sacrifice had become. For many in Fogerty's position, the experience of training was exhausting but clarifying. Days of repetitive drills, endless paperwork, and chain-of-command orders stripped away romantic notions of glory. It was service in the mechanical sense: repetition, hierarchy, and waiting for something that might never come. Yet amidst the monotony, there was time to think, to absorb the headlines that filtered through the barracks. Those headlines showed a widening chasm between rhetoric and reality. Politicians spoke of noble causes while the casualty numbers climbed. The photographs on television were no longer sanitized. They showed the cost, vividly. Fogerty would later say that what struck him wasn't only the death or chaos of war, but the hypocrisy surrounding it. He was wearing the uniform, bound by duty, while watching the privileged class send others to fight for their policies. The contradiction stayed with him. It wasn't anger toward soldiers. He respected them, but anger toward a system in which patriotism was demanded selectively. Those with the most to lose financially had the least to fear physically. It was a pattern repeating across history, but in Vietnam, it felt more exposed. Meanwhile, outside military bases and draft offices, tension escalated. Protests grew, songs echoed through campuses, and television amplified every confrontation. The country split between those who viewed refusal to serve as treason and those who considered blind obedience moral failure. Trapped between those extremes were the majority, ordinary young men who didn't seek conflict but couldn't escape it. In Fogerty's circle, some friends went, others didn't, but none escaped the shadow of the war. Each letter received, each name listed, reinforced how arbitrary fate had become. The draft transformed civic life. Families argued at dinner tables, churches agonized over moral duty, and entire communities quietly measured one another by who went and who didn't. The language of equality still appeared in official speeches, but the lived experience contradicted it daily. It wasn't politics, it was survival. The social wound ran deep enough to redefine how America saw itself. When people claim the 1960s were an age of peace and love, they forget that beneath the slogans, fear determined futures. Behind John Fogerty's laid-back public image, the resentment grew. He didn't speak loudly about politics, but his writing began to absorb the tension of the age. Where others wrote psychedelic poetry, he wrote clear, blunt lines. Where some indulged in abstraction, he preferred directness grounded in labor and sacrifice. His songs became coded diaries of the era's class friction, even before Fortunate Son found its voice. In each, there's the sound of a man who served enough to see the system from inside, but far enough from power to feel excluded from its protections. By the late 1960s, the phrase, "the draft and the divide," wasn't an analysis. It was a reality lived in barracks, factories, and small-town kitchens. The machinery of selective service had revealed what post-war optimism had hidden, that equality in America often stopped where influence began. For Fogerty, this realization would ferment into art. He carried it back to his guitar, his notebook, and his bandmates. The observations formed a kind of moral ledger, a record of who fought and who didn't, who claimed patriotism and who paid for it. The protest movement shouted in the streets, but Fogerty's rebellion stayed internal, waiting for sound. His experience wasn't of defiance against the flag, but of betrayal by its gatekeepers. Out of that contradiction, the pride of service mixed with disappointment and injustice, his musicianship sharpened. In the rhythm of marching boots and the hum of the barracks light, he began to hear something unresolved, a beat that would soon become a pulse of anger. Fogerty wasn't a radical. He was a witness, and though he couldn't know it then, those quiet realizations during his service would eventually ignite 3 minutes of music that told the truth better than any political speech. Because from within that system, he had seen both faces of America, the fortunate and the forgotten, and his guitar would soon speak for the latter. In 1966, at a modest recruiting office on the West Coast, John Fogerty raised his right hand. He'd just enlisted in the United States Army Reserve. It wasn't patriotism that brought him there as much as pragmatism. The draft was tightening, and every young man knew it. Serving in the reserves offered a narrow path through the maze, a way to fulfill obligation without being swallowed entirely by the war's machinery. It was a decision measured in caution, not ideology. His band, still searching for a break, rehearsed between his weekend drills. The dream of music hadn't vanished. It simply coexisted with the hum of boot camp. At Fort Bragg and later Fort Knox, Fogerty encountered the rhythm of military life. Early wake-ups, endless cues, and the thud of boots on gravel. He learned how repetition became its own language. For a young man shaped by melody, that cadence sank deep, each drill step echoing like a drum beat that might one day surface in song. Training turned ideals into routine. The romantic imagery of heroes and flags dissolved into schedules and ranks. New recruits barked orders without understanding them, and the days blurred into the monotony of waiting. Yet beneath the fatigue, Fogerty began noticing something pivotal. Around him stood men from small towns and working neighborhoods, the children of welders, bus drivers, mechanics. They spoke with familiar accents, traded stories about part-time jobs and local diners, and viewed the war with the same hesitant confusion. They'd go where ordered, but none claimed to understand why. It struck him who wasn't there. The sons of congressmen, executives, and celebrated athletes, the people with photographs in newspaper society pages, were conspicuously absent. He didn't need a statistic to feel the inequity. The silence where privilege should have been was proof enough. The army was supposed to be blind to class. What he saw was the opposite, the military reflecting the same divides he'd grown up around, only in sharper relief. Fort Bragg's vast training grounds became his classroom in authority. Fogerty learned how power functioned when obedience was mandatory. Orders cascaded downward, questions stopped at rank, and individuality was shaved away to fit the uniform. He respected discipline. It kept chaos at bay, but he noticed how easily it turned people into tools. The army didn't demand belief, it demanded compliance. That observation would linger, shaping not just his understanding of hierarchy, but his sense of what freedom truly meant. Evenings in the barracks brought quieter lessons. Amid creaking bunks and dusty fans, soldiers swapped letters from home, arguments about music, rumors about deployment. Some joked about lucky breaks, how a cousin managed to land a local guard spot, or a senator's nephew got desk duty. These stories fueled an undercurrent of resentment, a quiet recognition that fairness was mostly theoretical. Fogerty didn't yet frame it as politics. It was simply wrong, and the anger it sparked felt personal. After 6 months of active duty, Fogerty transitioned into the reserve cycle, monthly drills, occasional call-ups. Yet the experience didn't fade. He'd glimpsed the system from inside, seen how patriotism could coexist with self-interest. Back home in California, he returned to civilian rhythms, rehearsing with Creedence Clearwater Revival, working toward records that might pay rent. But part of his mind remained at those barracks, haunted by the echo of orders barked by men who'd never questioned them. The late 1960s were an odd crossroads. Public opinion fractured with each headline from Vietnam, yet Fogerty seldom spoke out. His frustration wasn't aimed at soldiers. He was one of them. It was aimed upward, toward the distance between those who decided wars and those who bore them. If anything, his reserve duty had given him empathy for both. He'd met kids terrified, yet loyal, obedient, yet uncertain. They weren't symbols or martyrs. They were faces he couldn't forget. Music soon became the only outlet that made sense. Between weekend drills and tour schedules, Fogerty internalized the rhythms of command, the call and response cadence, the crack of percussion, the stomp that demanded unity. These auditory memories later shaped Creedence's sound, tight, urgent, grounded. The band's straightforward arrangements mirrored his aversion to excess. Where others layered psychedelic haze, Fogerty preferred clarity, 4 instruments, clean rhythm, no illusions. It was authenticity forged by fatigue and repetition. The 1967 and 1968 nights spent writing songs carried traces of his service life. Tunes about rivers, rain, and restlessness replaced youthful love stories. Beneath their plain surfaces hid disillusionment. He'd seen how systems, military and political alike, could distort good intentions. Each lyric became a quiet form of processing, a way to reconcile pride in serving with disappointment in leadership. When deployment talks escalated, his reserve unit remained stateside. That safety wasn't victory. It was guilt's companion. Friends went and didn't return. Others came back changed, their laughter replaced by silence at gatherings. Fogerty absorbed their stories secondhand, weighed them against the slogans booming from newspapers, and felt the disconnect widen. The morale around him, both in camps and among civilians, drifted toward weariness. Patriotism began to sound scripted. Through it all, he held to his craft. Nights after rehearsals turned into early mornings with notebooks spread across a kitchen table. Anger simmered beneath restraint, waiting for something to set it ablaze. Though he couldn't articulate it yet, his time in uniform had become an unspoken ledger of privilege and pain, a silent score building toward confrontation. When fans later heard the bite in his voice, they sometimes mistook it for bravado. In truth, it was fatigue, the fatigue of a man who had seen systems up close and found them hollow. His growl wasn't rebellion for its own sake, it was exhaled disillusionment. By the time Creedence Clearwater Revival began gaining national attention, Fogerty carried 2 identities that rarely overlapped in popular music: soldier and skeptic. He knew the sound of command and the cost of obedience. That dual perspective gave his future protest not idealism, but credibility. He didn't hate the country. He hated unfairness disguised as patriotism. Toward the end of his service commitment, as the band's popularity rose, Fogerty quietly resolved to speak only through his songs. He'd serve his remaining drills, salute when required, then return home to his guitar. The years in uniform had clarified what his voice could fight for, not against soldiers or symbols, but against hypocrisy wherever it hid. The barracks light eventually switched off for the last time in his memory, replaced by stage lights and amplifiers. But inside that glare lived the same questions that had stared back from every inspection line. Who decides who fights? Who escapes? Those unanswered questions hummed like feedback under every note he played. When he finally picked up his pen to write what would become "Fortunate Son," the words poured out fast because they'd been writing themselves since Fort Bragg. Every salute, every absent name on a roster, every long march through muddy fields had been preparation. The soldier had turned observer, and the observer was ready to speak. In those silent years of service, John Fogerty had already begun tuning his rebellion. The next chord would make it unmistakable. By 1968, the illusion of unity that had carried post-war America through 2 decades was coming apart. The war in Vietnam no longer felt distant. It was televised dinner conversation. Families ate while watching footage of flaming jungles and medevac choppers. The names of small villages thousands of miles away became part of nightly broadcasts. For the first time in American history, the public could witness war in living color, and the sight was exhausting. That same year, the Tet Offensive struck, a coordinated wave of attacks that stunned the nation. U.S. officials had promised progress, victory even. Tet proved otherwise. The confidence that America was winning crumbled overnight, replaced by doubt, confusion, and anger. Students filled city streets, chanting against what they now saw as a war built on deception. Parents argued at kitchen tables. Church leaders split over morality versus duty. The line between patriotism and protest blurred until both sides claimed to defend true American values. And in that turmoil, something else was happening, a cultural upheaval. On one end, long-haired youth danced at music festivals preaching peace and love. On the other, National Guard units stood ready with tear gas and rifles outside universities. The American flag appeared on both their shoulders, symbolizing opposite meanings depending on who wore it. The country wasn't just divided politically, it was emotionally split. Every generation, every class, every hometown seemed to carry its own version of reality. For John Fogerty, returning home from reserve drills into that chaos was surreal. His band, Creedence Clearwater Revival, was finally breaking through commercially. In late-night rehearsals and endless studio sessions, the group shaped a sound that cut through the era's noise, a straightforward, swampy rock free of psychedelic excess. While others drifted into abstraction, Fogerty kept his songwriting grounded in tangible American imagery. Rivers, work, distance, survival. His voice carried a grit that felt familiar to factory workers and soldiers alike. By 1969, Creedence's songs were everywhere, on AM radios in trucks, construction sites, and barracks. The working-class audience treated Fogerty's lyrics as their reflection, a rare mirror that didn't glamorize struggle but acknowledged it. Yet as the band's fame grew, the country's fractures deepened. The Woodstock Festival that summer captured youthful optimism, but only months later, tragedy struck at Altamont Speedway when violence erupted at another concert. The moral contrast, utopia and breakdown, encapsulated the mood of the nation. Fogerty observed this dual reality with unease. His music was reaching millions, yet he felt the social fabric fraying in real time. Television screens showed war abroad and unrest at home, and he could sense listeners aching for songs that made sense of both. Creedence's authenticity resonated because it avoided fantasy. It sounded like the voice of those tired of slogans, people who didn't see revolution or glory, just work and loss. Then the unspoken truth hit him harder. For many who loved his songs, the war was personal. Letters arrived from soldiers who felt CCR's music kept them connected to home. In Vietnam's dense heat, Proud Mary and Green River played from portable cassette players. For them, these songs were reminders of the world they'd left behind. But for Fogerty, who viewed the conflict through a different lens, each message carried quiet heartbreak. These were his peers, boys his age, fighting a war others could buy their way out of. The reality gnawed at him. It wasn't rebellion against soldiers. It was empathy for them. The injustice wasn't their bravery, but the selective burden they carried. At home, protests escalated. The Kent State shootings, though still a year away, were foreshadowed by increasing confrontation between demonstrators and authorities. America seemed trapped in feedback loops of blame. Politicians faulted activists, activists faulted corporations, parents faulted youth culture, and youth faulted anyone over 30. The rhetoric grew louder than the reasons, and through it all, the draft machine kept grinding. Fogerty rarely made public statements about politics, but his songwriting began absorbing fragments of the noise around him. He noticed how patriotic language was being repurposed, politicians invoking God and country, while ordinary families sent their children into harm's way. The contradictions piled high. Support the troops became not a plea for compassion, but a tool to silence dissent. The realization burned deeper. The same language once used to unite citizens now divided them. Creedence Clearwater Revival recorded prolifically, releasing multiple albums within short spans. In that whirlwind, Fogerty's writing sharpened. The simplicity of his lyrics grew pointed, the melodies tighter. He wanted his songs to slice through illusion, yet he still avoided direct protest anthems. He didn't want to lecture. He wanted to testify. Each new single added weight to the working-class voice that mainstream culture often overlooked. Outside the studio, the contradictions multiplied. In small towns, parents hung gold star flags in windows while teenagers wore peace patches on denim jackets. One generation clung to honor, another demanded accountability. The emotional tone of the nation oscillated between grief and fury. Fogerty sensed that beneath the noise lay shared exhaustion, the feeling that everyone, regardless of politics, had been misled. In interviews of the time, he spoke cautiously, focusing on honesty rather than ideology. "We just play music that feels real," he'd say, deflecting deeper interpretation. But privately, the hypocrisy haunted him. Having witnessed the military hierarchy, he couldn't ignore how similar systems of privilege operated everywhere else. Media, politics, entertainment. The people who suffered the consequences rarely made the rules. By the end of 1969, that tension reached a boiling point. The war escalated again, the protest crowds swelled, and national trust in leadership crumbled. It felt as if two Americas were staring at each other from opposite sides of a widening canyon. Fogerty, caught between them, stood ready with pen and guitar, looking for a way to express the anger that had matured into conviction. One night, watching television coverage flicker across his living room, he saw a scene that encapsulated it all. The Nixon-Eisenhower wedding commanded headlines. A union of two powerful political families, broadcast like a national celebration. The contrast was undeniable. Young men dying overseas while power merged joyfully at home. In that moment, something shifted inside him. Years of deferred frustration, every memory from Fort Bragg, every headline of disparity found a single emotional outlet. He realized music could say what speeches could not. The soldier-turned-songwriter finally had his spark. Fogerty felt the anger crystallize, not against his country, but against the inequality that distorted its ideals. The noise of protests, the drone of helicopters, the cheers from televised banquets, all blended into one idea waiting to become sound. As Creedence prepared for their next recording sessions, he set his jaw and began writing with purpose. America was fracturing, but its noise had rhythm, a pulse of defiance buried beneath disillusionment. Fogerty would soon give that rhythm a voice. Out of confusion, he would carve clarity. Out of division, he would create one of the most enduring songs of the era, born not from ideology, but from lived truth. It all began with a television broadcast. In the fall of 1969, America tuned in to watch a wedding that felt less like a family gathering and more like a coronation. The bride was the president's daughter, the groom, the grandson of another president. Newspapers called it a union of dynasties. For many, it was a wholesome distraction. But for John Fogerty, sitting at home, it triggered something deeper, a flash of recognition that everything he'd witnessed about privilege during his service wasn't an isolated experience. It was the system itself, televised in celebration. The image of power congratulating power while young men his age fought and died overseas became the emotional strike that set everything loose. He wasn't enraged by the couple's happiness. He was enraged by what it symbolized. The sons of the elite were marrying safely under chandeliers, while ordinary families buried their children. It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. Fogerty realized he'd been looking at scenes of privilege all along, but this was the first time it crystallized as an emotion he could no longer hold back. Instead of shouting at the screen, he picked up his guitar. There was no prelude, no long drafting process. The song that would become Fortunate Son poured out of him in a single rush, about 20 minutes from first chord to final line. Every piece of pent-up frustration, every contradiction he'd observed since his days in the reserves, found rhythm and rhyme instinctively. He didn't stop to polish the grammar or soften the tone. He just let anger speak in plain American language. The words rolled like confessions, sarcastic, cutting, deliberate. He wasn't inventing characters. He was naming truths. Each verse sketched figures recognizable to anyone who'd watched fairness bend before influence. The politician's boy, the millionaire's heir, the patriotic figure who cheered war from comfort. They weren't villains in cartoons. They were citizens protected by social insulation so thick that even moral responsibility couldn't penetrate it. Fogerty had seen that phenomenon often. During his army service, letters from home mentioned acquaintances who'd received convenient deferments or improbable flat-footed medical exemptions. Now those same kinds of people were applauding the war effort, commanding others to support our boys. To him, the phrase didn't sound like solidarity, it sounded like self-defense. In his song, he wasn't mocking patriotism, he was reclaiming it. Musically, he kept the structure raw and urgent. The opening guitar riff, a tumble of chords propelled by Doug Clifford's tight drums, felt like an alarm bell. It wasn't polished. It was brash. Stu Cook's bass stayed bone simple, pulsing like a heartbeat, and Tom Fogerty's guitar locked into rhythm with the precision of machinery. John's voice cut through the mix like sandpaper on steel, sharp, hoarse, human. No studio tricks, no fancy overdubs. CCR's strength had always been restraint, and here it amplified the fury. The recording captured something no speechwriter could achieve. The track runs just over 2 minutes, yet it feels like a lifetime of indignation compressed into sound. It begins with confidence, major chords bright enough to deceive a casual listener, and within seconds, transforms that brightness into accusation. Listeners confused the tone for pride because it sounded anthemic, but beneath that drive lay mockery. Fogerty knew exactly what he was doing. He wrapped protest in the sonic language of outlaw joy, letting irony do the work. The phrase that anchors the chorus, his insistence that it ain't me, didn't come from theory. It came from instinct. It's personal and collective at once. He was speaking for millions who felt unseen, the workers, conscripts, and quiet believers who wanted to love their country but couldn't ignore its contradictions. That repetition, "It ain't me," became a rhythmic act of defiance, not against the flag, but against those who had turned patriotism into privilege. In the studio, the song came alive almost instantly. Creedence Clearwater Revival recorded Fortunate Son during sessions for their album Willie and the Poor Boys in 1969. There was no elaborate planning, just the raw element of chemistry. Fogerty led with conviction, driving the tempo faster than comfort allowed. The others followed, instinctively matching his urgency. What they captured wasn't rebellion crafted by committee. It was reaction turned art. The final take felt electric, each instrument slightly pushing against the others. Clifford's drum fills snapped like gunfire. Cook's bass thudded with the steadiness of marching boots. And when Fogerty howled through the verses, his voice carried the friction of someone confronting authority head-on. In under 3 minutes, They'd built a protest louder than any rally chant, yet radio-ready enough to slip into the mainstream. When the record hit the airwaves, listeners responded immediately. Some turned it up because it rocked harder than most singles on the charts. It sounded like motion, like gasoline and speed, tailor-made for long drives and loud jukeboxes. Few paused to consider the venom hiding in its grin. Radio programmers often introduced it as another Creedence hit. American energy, they called it. But for those who listened closely, the tone was unmistakable. Sarcasm sharpened into scripture. Within weeks, letters poured into magazines debating its message. Some called it unpatriotic. Others heard empathy for every working household sending sons to war. The song walked a line between anthem and accusation, and that tension made it unforgettable. It wasn't designed to comfort anyone. It was built to remind listeners who bore the cost of someone else's glory. In that way, it resonated with the same people who loved Fogerty's earlier songs about labor and resilience. They understood that "it ain't me" wasn't arrogance, it was exhaustion. In interviews, Fogerty rarely elaborated. When pressed, he'd say only that it was about not being one of those fortunate sons. Beneath that understatement lived a deeper truth. It was the most direct statement he could make, without turning into the very preacher he distrusted. He preferred the music to speak, confident that those meant to understand would. Historically speaking, Fortunate Son arrived at a cultural fever pitch. The war churned on, mistrust in government reached record heights, and popular music had split between escapism and protest. Creedence's sound crossed those boundaries. It delivered confrontation disguised as classic rock. Unlike folk protest songs, which sermonized gently, Fortunate Son attacked through rhythm. It was danceable outrage, dissent with a backbeat. For soldiers overseas, the irony deepened. Some adopted the song as a morale booster, blasting it from speakers during downtime, unaware or perhaps indifferent to its critique. Others recognized the subtext immediately, claiming it as their own unspoken statement. The dual meaning mirrored the national divide, pride and protest contained in a single piece of music. Fogerty watched this happen with mixed emotions. On one hand, the song spread farther than he ever imagined. On the other, it proved how easily meaning could warp once released into the world. While politicians lauded patriotism on television, their images often shared airtime with the very riff condemning them. The contradiction wasn't lost on him. Music had made him powerful enough to challenge privilege, yet powerless to control interpretation. Still, he stood by the instinct that birthed the song. To him, Fortunate Son wasn't about cynicism, it was about clarity. It voiced the realization that equality proclaimed from podiums meant nothing if only some bled for it. The track stripped patriotism of performance and replaced it with honesty. Its anger was clean, almost moral. By channeling frustration into melody rather than rhetoric, Fogerty achieved something rare. He created a time capsule of American conscience. In 20 minutes of writing and 2.5 of performance, he captured the collective ache of a generation learning that love of country could coexist with outrage at injustice. That paradox became the song's heartbeat. As the single climbed the charts, it no longer belonged solely to him. It belonged to every listener who had ever felt unseen in a land of claimed equality. And whether chanted by protesters or blared from car radios, the fury remained intact, still echoing the moment when one man, staring at a television screen filled with privilege, decided that silence was no longer an option. When Fortunate Son first hit the airwaves, America didn't know what to make of it. The opening riff was pure ignition, bright, fast, and impossible to ignore. To many listeners, it felt triumphant. The guitars marched forward, the drums hit like fireworks, and Fogerty's raw voice carried the same energy as a rallying cry. The song sounded like courage, even victory. And that sonic misdirection would shape its legacy for decades. It's one of the great paradoxes in music history, a protest song mistaken for patriotism. That confusion didn't come from ignorance alone, it came from instinct. The beat of Fortunate Son taps directly into something primal, the rhythm of determination, the sound of confidence. It explodes with the pulse of a nation certain of itself, even when its lyrics question everything that certainty stands on. Audiences heard the anthem they wanted, not the confession they were given. The musical structure helped disguise the truth. The song's major chords and ascending progressions carried emotional brightness, the same harmonic DNA used in celebration songs. Unlike the slow laments of other protest anthems, Fortunate Son drives forward. There's no mourning, only motion. To listeners flipping through radio stations in 1969, that energy spoke of endurance, not dissent. In an era steeped in confusion and despair, the track sounded like relief. Commercial radio added its own distortion. DJs rarely introduced it as a political statement. It was the new Creedence hit, another rocker from the band that kept America moving. The words, dense with irony, got flattened into rhythm. Many listeners sang along without realizing they were echoing the anger of a man condemning the very privilege some of them enjoyed. That subtle irony made the song dangerous and magnetic. Dangerous because it accused, without separating itself from the people it accused. And magnetic because it spoke to emotions listeners couldn't articulate. As months passed, the misinterpretation grew like folklore. Soldiers took the song overseas, playing it on portable radios in base camps. Some understood its bitter edge and adopted it as their unofficial anthem of resentment, a mirror of the injustice they felt. Others just loved the groove. They weren't dissecting class politics. They were seizing a moment of sound that reminded them of home. For many, it represented pride, the good kind, the determination to endure whatever came. That's the strange phenomenon of art meeting collective emotion. Context bends. The same chords that Fogerty wrote in anger became a soundtrack for courage, and he didn't condemn that reinterpretation. Even if it missed the point, it kept the song alive. Yet as years rolled forward, especially after the war's end, the distortion deepened. America had a habit of turning rebellion into nostalgia. The anger of the 60s was comforting to remember, less comfortable to reckon with. Television and film played a decisive role in rewriting meaning. In the decades that followed, Fortunate Son became cinematic shorthand for the Vietnam era. Filmmakers needed a few notes to tell audiences, this is the 60s, this is Vietnam, and Creedence delivered instantly recognizable mood. Helicopters, troops boarding transports, jungle vistas, the song's opening riff became the go-to audio cue. Ironically, the placement often made it appear celebratory, a musical frame for military might, rather than moral questioning. The most famous example came years later, when blockbuster storytelling began to treat the Vietnam War less as tragedy and more as iconography. Fortunate Son accompanied scenes of helicopters lifting off to glory, not realities of disparity. New generations watching these depictions absorbed the sound divorced from its intent. It wasn't defiance anymore, it was adrenaline. Fogerty's howl of "It ain't me" shifted from protest to power anthem. Political campaigns also joined the misreading chorus. Candidates looking for populist stripes plugged the song into loudspeakers at rallies. Crowds waved flags as the riff rang out, unaware or unbothered that the lyrics condemned inherited privilege. The spectacle was surreal. The very fortunate sons the song called out were now using it to project authenticity. Fogerty watched footage of those rallies in disbelief, realizing the gap between creation and interpretation could swallow meaning whole. At first, he tried to clarify publicly. In interviews, he explained the song wasn't anti-soldier or anti-America. It was anti-entitlement. But explanations seldom travel as far as an anthem. Once a crowd decides what something means, correction sounds like interruption. The irony became part of the work's fate. He had written something too sharp to remain tame, too loud to remain subtle. Culturally, that misunderstanding tells us something profound about the American ear. The country often celebrates the echo rather than the message. An aggressive rhythm and major key swing felt patriotic, so people embraced it. The nation wanted a hero's march, not a working man's complaint. Fortunate Son fit both molds sonically, depending on how closely one listened. That duality gave the song endurance. It could live comfortably in both rebellion and ritual. Meanwhile, the rock radio era of the 1970s and 80s enshrined Creedence as quintessential Americana. DJs placed Fortunate Son alongside songs about highways, freedom, and summer. Its haunting critique dissolved into feel-good nostalgia. Fogerty's fury faded under the volume of collective memory, a reminder that popular culture prefers energy over evidence. The crowd remembered how it made them feel, not what it said. Yet the song's spirit still lurked beneath the gloss. Every so often, context would realign. When protests rose in later decades, against inequality, against wars that smelled too familiar, Fortunate Son resurfaced with renewed accuracy. Listeners rediscovered the bitterness behind the beat. Younger audiences heard lyrics that resonated in fresh ways. The sense that wealth still purchased safety, that patriotism was often performed rather than lived. The misunderstanding had incubated relevance. Through confusion, the song stayed timeless. There's a psychological truth here. People absorb sound faster than sense. When a song carries them emotionally, the meaning follows the mood. Fortunate Son energizes, so listeners feel strong, even when the words reject strength as inherited privilege. It's a case study in how music communicates across contradictions, an unintentional mirror of the America Fogerty described. A country that claims justice yet rewards advantage. A people moved more by rhythm than by reflection. The paradox also explains its ubiquity. Because the song could serve both pride and protest, it never fell out of favor. Radio programmers could spin it on Independence Day without controversy, and protesters could chant it at demonstrations the same week. Few compositions managed that dual life for so long. It's why no other track captures the cultural ambiguity of the Vietnam generation quite like this one. For Fogerty, that duality carried both pride and frustration. He was grateful the song endured, but pained that its morals still needed rediscovery. Each time it blared beneath triumphant images of fighter jets or political rallies, he'd shake his head, because the irony wasn't hidden, it was broadcast. But ultimately, he recognized that once art enters public hands, ownership changes. The mishearing became part of its destiny. Fortunate Son stopped belonging only to its author and became the nation's self-portrait. Half aware, half denying, wholly American. And so, decades after its release, the song stands as a paradox carved in vinyl, an angry protest forever mistaken for a salute. Its joyous rhythm disguises its indictment, yet that disguise ensures its survival. Every time those opening chords roar from a speaker somewhere, from a stadium, a commercial, or a protest line, it reminds listeners, knowingly or not, of the thin line between pride and protest. That confusion isn't a flaw. It's the truest reflection of the country that inspired it. For all its misreadings and contradictions, Fortunate Son refused to fade. By the mid-1970s, the Vietnam War had ended, but the wounds it opened in American identity remained. Soldiers came home to divided welcomes, celebrated by some, shunned by others. The war's supporters wanted to move on. Its critics wanted reckoning. In between stood a generation that had lost trust. And through this uneasy silence, Creedence Clearwater Revival's anthem of outrage kept spinning on radios, uniting people who scarcely agreed on what it meant. John Fogerty found himself in a strange position. The song that had sprung from his frustration was now an institution. It played in diners, baseball stadiums, and on jukeboxes beside cheerful hits from the same decade. Every roar of recognition from a crowd reminded him of its endurance and also of its distortion. As the years went on, he struggled to separate pride from dismay. Fortunate Son had survived the war, but surviving meant carrying every misinterpretation along with it. Fogerty talked often about that frustration. In interviews, he confessed amazement that politicians used the track at campaign rallies, sometimes the very kind of leaders he'd been furious with decades earlier. Seeing Fortunate Son blare over loudspeakers at events attended by the powerful was almost surreal. It was as if irony had become national tradition. He once remarked that when he wrote it, he wasn't attacking America, he was defending fairness. Time hadn't changed the imbalance, only the slogans used to hide it. But the power of music lies in its elasticity. Each generation finds its own way into a song's core, even if that journey begins with misunderstanding. By the 1980s and 90s, as the children of Vietnam veterans grew up, Fortunate Son took on a new resonance. Its lyrics sounded like a warning echo from the past, reminding listeners how privilege shapes sacrifice. The booming guitar riff that once jolted a nation now carried memory, a bridge between what was endured and what was learned. For working and middle-class families, the song remained personal. Many parents who'd watched sons and brothers leave in the late 60s heard the same chords decades later and felt the same ache. Fogerty's howl seemed to preserve time, keeping youthful anger intact. In that sense, Fortunate Son became what every enduring protest song eventually turns into: history disguised as sound. People's memories attached themselves to the track so tightly that the song evolved beyond a single meaning. It became a vessel for reflection. Fogerty himself wrestled with both gratitude and heartbreak. In moments, he seemed astonished that something he wrote in 20 minutes had outlived empires of pop music. But pride gave way to the heavier realization that the injustices fueling his lyrics hadn't vanished. New wars arrived, each carrying familiar patterns. The wealthy still found ways to stay safe. The poor still carried banners of duty. The names on the uniforms changed, but the hierarchy remained stubbornly the same. Fortunate Son wasn't an artifact of the 60s anymore. It was evidence. Yet among veterans, the song earned complex respect. Many who served heard in Fogerty's voice not accusation, but empathy. They understood that his anger reached upward, not outward. He wasn't dismissing those who fought, but calling out those who hid behind their service. That distinction mattered profoundly to people who'd returned from a conflict, feeling misunderstood. Decades later, when Fogerty performed for veterans' causes, the cheers carried reconciliation. The circle between protester and soldier closed, at least temporarily, under mutual recognition. By the early 200s, the track began another cycle of rediscovery. Protest movements, from labor demonstrations to anti-war rallies, resurrected its chorus. For younger audiences, the Vietnam timeline felt distant, yet the emotion felt current. Corporate influence, political nepotism, and widening inequality gave the song fresh relevance. Each repetition of "It Ain't Me" echoed through speakers at marches around issues Fogerty could never have predicted: economic collapse, outsourcing, student debt. The fight had changed shape, but the refrain still fit. Digital platforms introduced Fortunate Son to listeners who weren't even born when it charted. Its streaming resurgence proved that age doesn't dull authenticity. The track's analog grit sounded almost radical in an era of studio perfection, reminding ears accustomed to polish that protest, at its best, scuffs and distorts. And while Fogerty embraced new audiences, he remained protective of the song's soul. He spoke about intent without preaching, urging listeners to hear not just the volume, but the message beneath it. The record became less of an anthem and more of a conversation between decades. Critical reappraisal soon followed. Music historians began treating Fortunate Son not only as anti-war commentary, but as one of the earliest mainstream indictments of class double standards in popular culture. It stood apart from the counterculture's self-conscious rebellion. It belonged instead to the working-class tradition of truth-telling through plain speech. Scholars noted that its enduring popularity stemmed precisely from that simplicity, the refusal to hide political honesty behind abstraction. It told the hard truth in 3 chords. No overt ideology required. Fogerty's later performances leaned into that heritage. He often introduced the song with humility, dedicating it to anyone who had served, regardless of opinion. Time had softened his bitterness, but sharpened his perspective. Injustice might be constant, but awareness could grow. On stage, Fortunate Son no longer sounded like an outburst. It sounded like testimony. Younger musicians watched those sets and learned a quiet lesson. Music can preserve protest, even when words lose their bite. There's something almost paradoxical about the track's journey. It began as spontaneous fury, a veteran's private release, and ended as cultural scripture. Its meaning shifted with decades, yet its heartbeat never changed. Perhaps that explains why it still cuts through noise today. Listeners sense authenticity even when they misread its message. The groove still carries conviction, and conviction, more than politics, keeps art alive. Looking back, Fortunate Son functions like a mirror. Each era sees in it what it fears or misses most. The protests of the 60s heard betrayal. The movies of the 80s heard pride. The activists of the 200s heard warning. It keeps teaching because America keeps forgetting. That repetition of outrage, revision, rediscovery isn't failure. It's continuity. Every revival of the song signals another generation, asking whether opportunity and obligation are still proportionate. For Fogerty, the echo finally brought peace. He understood that he couldn't control what people heard, only why he wrote it. The track had done its work. It revealed character, not consensus. Its survival proved that truth, when set to rhythm, can outrun distortion. He came to see the misinterpretations not as defeats, but as proof that art remains alive when it provokes disagreement. Today, half a century onward, those opening chords still strike nerves. They ring out at sports arenas, streaming through playlists of listeners who might not know the backstory. Yet hidden between beats remains the same challenge he issued in 1969, to question who calls themselves fortunate and at whose expense. The anger may have aged, but the empathy endures. Fortunate Son is no longer just John Fogerty's protest. It's the country's memory, unresolved, necessary, and deeply human. The song lives where anger meets hope, where disillusionment turns into witness. And every time that riff returns, it carries the unending reminder that honesty, even when misunderstood, never truly goes out of style. More than 50 years after its release, Fortunate Son still hums through the American air like a restless memory. The first seconds feel alive, those guitars racing forward, but it's the undercurrent of truth that makes them last. The song has never belonged to any one generation. It belongs to every moment when fairness and patriotism collide, when pride asks to be examined. Historically speaking, it functions less as protest and more as mirror. Through it, you hear the contradiction of a country that celebrates equality while quietly preserving hierarchy. The draft may be gone, but the pattern remains recognizable. Opportunity still uneven, sacrifice still unevenly distributed. Fogerty's howl endures because it doesn't promise resolution. It demands recognition. The track reminds listeners that love of country means wanting honesty from it. What keeps Fortunate Son timeless isn't just its riff, It's its refusal to lie. It captures a mood no anthem ever should have to describe, the ache of believing in ideals while watching them compromised. You can sense in Fogerty's voice the fatigue of someone who served, observed, and then told the truth in plain rhythm. There are no metaphors, no layers of ambiguity, just a working man's refusal to pretend. That honesty, more than its politics, rooted it in American conscience. The irony remains. A song written in anger became a staple of celebration. But maybe that's appropriate. Every time it resurfaces at a rally or in a film, it gives listeners another chance to ask what they're hearing. The misreadings have preserved the music. The meaning waits patiently underneath. Its longevity proves that even misunderstood art can guide memory toward clearer sight. If there's a central lesson in the journey of Fortunate Son, it's that music can survive distortion as long as truth lingers in its core. It urges you to listen beyond momentum, to notice who's being praised and who's paying. That message feels as immediate today as the day Fogerty scribbled his fury onto paper. So the next time those chords thunder from a speaker, listen a little closer. Beneath the drive and defiance is a question still unanswered. What kind of nation calls itself equal yet spares its elite from sacrifice? The song endures because that question does. And if stories like this remind you why music matters, stay a while. Subscribe for more explorations of the soundtracks that remember more than we do, songs that keep history honest,